So welcome to week 5 of our advanced exam or our advanced section. Before we begin, I want to talk about the colony tags. And so I know I've mentioned it a little bit, but we finally got our card reader figured out so we can print you guys personalized tags. So let me attach the link to sign up in the chat. And like I mentioned beforehand, this is totally free, and so you really have the option of doing it or not doing it. Um, but one thing we're doing is printing these personalized tags with your beekeeper ID, colony ID, and then the year. And then we'll have each month. And so as you do inspections, each month or maybe 4 times a year, you can cross out the month you do the inspection. And so I did a recording for the apprentice level about hive inspections and what our hive inspection sheet looks like. And so if you're interested and you want a personalized colony tag, we can pretty much print everything, anything on this. And so if you have your own company or your own label, or you want to put something specifically on this tag, we can print that for you. And so I put that all in the chat. And basically, you just fill out that form and you tell us like how many colonies you want tags for. You just give us an address to ship the information to, and we'll get everything printed as soon as possible. Yeah, and yeah, Disa said that you already signed up for it. So it said if we already signed up when you sent the first email, do we need to sign up again? No. So if you signed up already, you should be good. But if you haven't and you want these colony tags, you can just use that link and sign up right away. So we'll probably get these printed probably here in the next week or so. But if you have any questions, feel free to shoot me or Heather an email. So we're gonna jump to splitting colonies. I'm just curious if anybody's done splitting before. I'm assuming some of you have done splitting, maybe some of you haven't done splitting before. And I'm just curious of what type of method do you use for splitting? Dodie,
Yes, I've done lots of splits.
what type of splits do you use? Just traditional
Um,
splits or
it kind of all depends. I feel like I have a bunch of tools in my toolbox and I do whatever I need to do at the time. If I get to plan it though, I like to divide the brood between the two brood boxes and let the nurse bees travel back and forth, level out themselves. So I don't have to find the old queen.
yeah, one method I was kind of looking into was the Terranova splitting method. I've never done it before. I'll talk about it a little bit, but I don't have much experience with that. So I'm just curious if there's any like different methods that people use. Ski, you've used a Terranova, or you use a split?
Garrett, I've done a tearing off split. It's a lot of fun.
Is it?
Yeah.
Well, maybe once you get that section, you can talk about it a little bit more because I've never done it before, so I'm curious. I guess the methods for it.
Yeah, I actually learned it from the Roger Farr. He's a master beekeeper in the program. He did a presentation on it at Longview Club years ago. So,
Is it a lot of work or not too
I
bad?
mean, basically you're kind of like creating, it's kind of like creating a swarm in a way. So, I mean, as long as you don't have a problem with dealing with lots of bees.
Sure, sure.
So, but I don't know. I like it. It's fun. It's not something that I do routinely though.
Yeah, that was kind of my impression. I usually use like an overnight or traditional split, but I might try the Terranov split at some point just to see how well it works.
Yeah, I think it's good, like if you have swarm cells in a hive and you want to go ahead and split it that way.
Sure.
So,
Well, yeah, once we get to that section, I'll have Heather talk about it because I know she has some experience with it. I've experienced with the other types of splits, but I've never used that method before. So whenever we get to that point, I'll have Heather jump in and she can talk about it in a bit more detail. I think James had his hand raised. Maybe we lost him. Okay, I'm just gonna share my screen and then we'll get started. Okay, today for the first section we'll talk about just splitting colonies, and this is something that most beekeepers get into probably into their second, third year or so, and it seems like most of you have split colonies before, And so today I'll talk about just like different methods for splitting. I'm sure some of you have tried different splitting methods, and I think for a lot of beekeepers it can be really intimidating to split your colonies for the first time, but it's really not that much extra work. There's a lot of different ways of doing it. Some methods like walkaway splits, like somebody mentioned, you don't need to purchase your own queens, but other methods you may need to buy, a queen cell or mated queen to make your splits. And so there's definitely a lot of different ways to split your colony. And there's really not a right way or wrong way of doing it. Beekeepers do it in a lot of different ways. Some beekeepers make, one frame splits with one frame of brood. Some make really strong splits with three frames of brood. Some beekeepers make full splits where they're splitting a full double deep colony into multiple colonies. And so there's really not a wrong way of doing it. It just kind of depends on your preference and really the resources that you have in the colony. So yeah, I just want to define, kind of splits, nooks, and packages because I'll use some of these interchangeably. And so splits basically mean you're dividing a really strong colony into two or more colonies, either to potentially prevent swarming or increase your hive numbers. So whether you want to have more colonies in your operation or whether you're trying to replace winter losses. And so splitting just basically means taking one colony and splitting into multiple colonies. Nooks is a sort of outcome of a split, and so some beekeepers make full splits into multiple, deep colonies, or some beekeepers make splits directly into nooks. So whether these nooks are just kind of smaller colonies you're maintaining until you transfer them to a larger colony, or maybe you're a beekeeper that's selling nooks to local beekeepers or other beekeepers across the state. So nooks is just a really great way to begin making your splits and help your colony kind of grow during this springtime. And then packages. I'm not sure if many beekeepers here make packages or sell packages. It's really not that common in Texas, especially with all the pollen coming in, and the Nook sales are really something I recommend to new beekeepers. Like I prefer them to rather buy Nooks rather than packages. But if you do have experiences making packages or sell packages, please let me know and send something in the chat. So there's a lot of different reasons for splitting your colony. One of the major reasons is swarm management. And so, if your colony gets really large, there's a lot of bees in the colony, there's not enough space. One good way to mitigate that or manage swarming is by splitting your colonies into multiple colonies. And so that's one way to prevent swarming and reduce the chance of your colony from swarming. Probably the major reason that people split their colonies is to simply increase their numbers. And so, if you start with a few colonies and you want more colonies in your operation, or you just really love beekeeping a lot and you want more bees, one of the best ways to increase numbers is by splitting your colonies. It's also a lot cheaper. And so a lot of you know how expensive, nooks or even packages can be. And so a really cost-effective way for increasing your numbers is by simply splitting your colonies or making four-frame nooks. Another thing is, strengthening weaker colonies. And no, so I know some beekeepers, have four-frame nooks throughout the year to sort of heart transplants for colonies. And so sometimes they maintain these four-frame nooks, and then if a colony gets really weak or becomes queenless, they can add that nook as sort of transplant into weaker colonies. But it also be a great way to supplement weaker colonies. So maybe taking brood and bees from one colony place them into weaker colonies to really help boost that colony, especially if you really do like the weaker queens or weaker colonies. Another reason is replacing winter losses. And so, some beekeepers have higher winter losses, somewhere between 30 to 50%, even more than that. And so a really great way to replace winter losses is by splitting, one of your stronger colonies into, smaller colonies like these nooks. And so there's definitely a lot of different reasons for splitting. It's a really fun way to keep bees. It's a really fun way to, make multiple colonies from one. So swarm management, so why do honeybees swarm? There's really three major reasons. The major reason is overcrowding. And so when your colony starts brooding up, your queen starts laying eggs and the bees are kind of exploding within your colonies, especially here in the spring, you can, lead to overcrowding. And so I've already heard a lot of reports of swarming occurring already. And so, this could be a really great time to begin splitting and reduce the chance of your bees from swarming and reduce the overcrowding with that one colony. Another reason is, just abundance of resources. And so when there's a lot of pollen and nectar coming to the colony, the bees need a place for that to store those resources. And so oftentimes they'll, if there's a lot of research coming in and there's not enough space in the boxes, they start storing it where the queen's laying eggs. And that could, lead to less space that the queen has available to lay eggs and brood up. And so in that situation, the colony might be more likely to swarm. And then it's just genetics. And so some stocks are just more prone to swarming than other ones. And so, for example, if you're catching, swarms or doing bee removals, these stocks could be more prone to swarming. And so, kind of depends on the genetics of your colony, whether they're more or less likely to swarm. And one thing I typically look for is some of these nervous queen cells. And so some colonies produce these really small queen cells. The queen's not laying eggs in them, but it's almost like the colony's preparing to swarm, just in a situation where they don't have the space or they don't have a place to store the resources. So I'll talk quickly about kind of swarm and swarm management. And so when a colony becomes overcrowded, or maybe they have a genetic propensity to swarming, a situation where half the colony and the queen will fly off and really try to find a new home. And so in a case where the swarm leaves the colony, they form these kind of orientation flights around the top of the colony, and they're typically flying above the colony for, maybe 1 to 2 hours, not very long. And their goal is kind of orient themselves and find a new temporary home. So oftentimes this gets confused with robbing, and so especially for a lot of new beekeepers, they kind of view this orientation flight as robbing behavior, but it's really a lot different from robbing in that they're kind of flying and orienting themselves. After they're kind of done with their orientation flight and basically telling all the workers like, "Hey, this is where we need to go," and all the bees are on the same page, they fly to a tree branch or a fence post or something that's sort of a temporary home. And so oftentimes they'll form these swarms on a tree branch or a fence post. And this is just a temporary home, and this is what a lot of people that, they may only be here for an hour or two, maybe, a couple days tops. And so they'll typically kind of form this cluster or the swarm on the top of a tree branch. But what they're trying to do is they're trying to find a more permanent home. And so what they do is they have maybe 10 or 15 scout bees, and those scout bees, their only role is to fly out and find a new potential home for that colony. So the scout bees will fly out and say, okay, here's a tree that we can build a home in. One scout bee will fly out and say, okay, here's a structure or a house that we can build a home in, and so on. They'll come back, they'll do a waggle dance, and they try to convince the rest of the bees to go to that new home. Now, with bees, they have to reach a consensus to fly out to that new home. And so there may be 10 scout bees coming back, doing that waggle dance and convincing those workers to go to that home. But they want to convince all the workers, 100% of the workers, to, dance with them. And so it's sort of a democratic process where 100% of the workers have to agree on one home. And so sometimes, if you look at some research by Tom Seeley and his Honeybee Democracy books, he talked about this a lot more. I really recommend the book. It's a really great read. It's a really fun read, and Tom Seeley does a really fantastic job of really describing this process. What happens is, maybe 70% of the bees will dance with one bee, whereas 30% will be dancing with one bees. But because they're not reaching consensus, they don't agree on going to that home. But eventually, over time, they'll kind of transition to one bee, where eventually all the bees are doing the wiggle dance, following that one scout bee and agreeing to go to that new home. Once they agree to go to the new home, they fly out, and then basically what they do is they start building the wax, building the colony, and the queen begins laying eggs. And so they form these, really permanent homes where they fly out to. These permanent homes can be in a tree, they can be in a structure. Sometimes they form these open air colonies that are formed right on the tree branch. I think that's a situation where the bees just don't agree and they decide, okay, we'll just stay here and build a home. I'm not quite sure why they form open air colonies, but there's, it could be a process where, they never agree on one specific home, so they decide just to build wax there. So that's a little bit about, swarming behavior. And one thing to look for when you're if you're not sure when your bees are kind of entering that swarming mode, the best thing to look for are these swarm cells. These are queen cells that are built on the bottom of the frame. Sometimes if the wax isn't fully drawn out on the top, they'll kind of build the wax kind of along where the wax and the plastic meet. And so oftentimes they're found at the bottom, but sometimes they can be found kind of the edges where the wax meets the actual plastic. Now, if you start seeing queen cells like this, where they're fully closed, that's a sign that your bees may be about to swarm. And so that's a good situation where you might want to do a split so you can reduce the chance for the bees are swarming and you have to worry about, following the bees and trying to catch the swarm at another point. But if your cells are open like this, there's a really good chance that one, your bees are about to swarm, or two, your bees have already swarmed. And so if you start seeing these open queen cells, it's sort of a sign of almost no return. I wouldn't say that's always the case, but it's a sign that your bees are about to swarm, if not swarmed already. Really, the reason for me when I do my splitting, it's more for increasing numbers, and so for our bees here in Overton, we have about 100 colonies, but we'd have some winter losses, and so one of our reasons for splitting is to make up for those winter losses and have more bees available. And especially for us, for part of our breeding program, we want to have more and more bees available to select from and potentially graft and breed from. And so one of my major reasons and our major reasons for splitting is simply by increasing numbers. And I think this is typically the case for a lot of beekeepers. Another reason is strengthening weak colonies, and so I know a lot of beekeepers they try to keep four frame nooks throughout the summer in case a colony loses the queen or becomes really weak. And a lot of beekeepers kind of use this analogy, sort of a heart transplant. So having these four frame nooks available, for your colonies could be a really great way to potentially supplement the colony or add a queen to that colony. But you can also strengthen the colony by splitting your large colony. So you can take bees and brood from one colony and add it to a weak colony like this to supplement that and really boost those bee populations. And so this is another good reason for splitting. And so I mean, let's say you have six colonies and three are really weak, you can supplement those with these new bees. Now, one reason those colonies are weak is probably due to the queen, and so you still might want to raise new queens, but it's a really great way to boost these colonies. Another reason for splitting is by simply replacing your winter losses. And so we've been hearing a lot of reports by high colony losses, especially for commercial beekeepers. And so for the commercial beekeepers, they're trying to split to replace those winter losses. And so they could have, 5 to 10,000 colonies and they lose 50%. It's a really great way to replace those dead outs. And so for small scale beekeepers, and the reports for colony losses aren't as high for small scale beekeepers, but even if you lose 30%, it's a really great way to supplement those colonies and replace those winter losses. It's also a lot cheaper than buying new bees. And so Nook prices are pretty high, and even package prices are really high. And so it's a really great cheap way to replace those winter losses and get more bees in your operation. And so, but also it's a great way to supplement new colonies with survivors. And so, one reason that certain colonies may survive is they may have natural defenses against, Varroa or viruses and maybe more productive. And so, by using those bees and raising queens from those bees could be a really great way to have some of these survivor stocks and more locally adapted stocks in your operation. And so, a really good reason is to replace these winter losses. Oh, my screen froze here. Quick, I'll go back. Okay, so another good reason for splitting is just simply viral management. And so we talked a lot about this a couple of weeks ago during the viral section. So, one thing with viral management is, the mites tend to hide inside this brood. And so even if you do a mite wash and you're collecting mites and doing the mite monitoring, you may know where your mite levels are for the phoretic mites, the ones on the back of the bees, but there's always going to be a lot of mites hiding inside these brood cells. And that makes treatment and management of Varroa extremely difficult because treatments don't go into the brood cells and kill mites within the brood cells. And so one good reason for splitting is by simply introducing a brood break. And so basically exposing all the mites to a treatment during splitting could be a really great way to manage your viral levels and effectively control them early in the spring. And so one way that brood breaks work is when you split a colony, you're basically replacing that new nook or that new split with a queen. So either you're doing a walkaway split where the colony is raising their own queen, either you're introducing a queen cell where that queen's gonna eventually emerge and then mate with local drones, or you're introducing a mated queen. Either way, at some point there's gonna be a brood break. And that could be a really great way to target that brood break because there's no more cap brood in the colony. All those mites are exposed on the back of the workers, and that makes some of these treatments more effective. And so splitting can be a really great way to manage your viral levels. But also, when you split a colony, you're not only splitting the workers into multiple colonies, but you're also splitting the mite levels into multiple colonies. So that makes, varroa management a lot easier and allows you to do more organic options or cultural options to control your varroa levels. And so for me, I think splitting is a really great way to manage your varroa levels. If you kind of think about it this way, one of the natural defenses for rural management, especially for bees that are in Africa or Asia, is by the swarming behavior. So swarming occurs when half the colony flies out and forms a new home, but that also introduces a really great brood break and it disrupts the mite reproductive cycle. And so splitting is sort of a natural behavior and defense against varroa. And so by doing splitting, you're basically doing your own kind of artificial swarming. You're splitting the colonies in half, and you're introducing this really important brood break. And so I would recommend if you're doing any sort of brood break to really target that brood break and try to manage your rows during that point. Oxalic acid is a really great option during this brood break because it's a contact treatment. It's not heat specific, and it's really effective for killing the mites, especially when they're all exposed and outside the brood. And so, I talked about this a lot more during the Varroa section, but there's three types of, Varroa treatments, oxalic acid-based treatments for Varroa. You can do a drizzle, so basically mixing the oxalic acid crystals with sugar water and drizzling them on top of the colony. And so you can buy, wood bleach from a store, for example, or you can go to any bee supply store and they sell oxalic acid, and they have all the mixtures for how to mix that with sugar water, and then you dosage it. You basically spray it in between each frame. And so it works really well when there's no brood in the colony. So that's why it's a really great method to use during a brood break. It's a contact treatment, and so when you're drizzling it over and all the bees on the back, all the mites on the back of the bees, it'll kill basically all the mites are exposed to this drizzle. But it also has a short treatment window, so the time of application. So when you're drizzling it over the colony, that's when it's killing the mites. And so it's sort of a 1 day treatment. But if you have a 1 or 2 day brood break, that's a really great time to apply this drizzle and manage mites that way. We have fumigation, and so some of you beekeepers may have a vaporizer, for example. Some can be more expensive. Obviously, more expensive ones work a lot better, but you can buy a cheaper one. I think the prices range from somewhere between 100 to thousands of dollars, and so but this is a great way where they basically heat up the oxalic acid. It forms this fumigant smoke, and it fumes throughout the entire colony. So it's a really great way to reach all the colonies or all the bees within the colony. So one thing with the drizzle, you're basically drizzling it randomly on the colony, whereas this fumigation could spread more rapidly and connect with more of the mites. But similar to a drizzle, it's a contact treatment, and so it's only going to affect the mites that are contacted by this fume, but it also has a short treatment window, so it's only killing the mites during that point. One option is Roxanne. It's a brand new oxalic acid strip. I know it's getting more and more difficult to buy because I know it's a pretty brand new treatment. But what's good about this is it's extended release treatment. And so instead of working at the day of treatment, it can work for somewhere between 46 to 52 days. And so one thing you could do is during your split, you could add these oxalic acid strips inside your split, and then as those mites are emerging from the cells, it's going to consistently kill those mites over, a month and a month and a half period. And so this would makes this really effective. And I know a lot of beekeepers what they're starting to do is they're making their 4 frame nooks or making their splits, putting these strips inside those splits, and then adding like a queen cell or mated queen. And so it's killing the mites as they're emerging, but also you get that really important brood break at some point, depending on which queen you introduce, and it's gonna kill all the mites that way. It also doesn't impact the queen at all. So oxalic acid is an organic option. We know there's pretty much a low chance of getting mite resistant, but we know it's not going to impact the queen. So a lot of beekeepers historically use Apivar or Amitraz, and we know by using Amitraz during these splits that directly impacted the queen and her mating quality. And so I think Viroxan could be a really, really great option to use during these splits. So timing split, it really depends on your preference. What's really great about here in Texas is you have a lot more wiggle room for splitting your colonies. And so, when I guess I've done a lot of beekeeping in the Midwest, mostly, North Dakota, Minnesota, Indiana. And it was really hard for us to do any kind of late season splits because we didn't really have a heavy honey flow in the fall. Our winters hit pretty hard around, late September, early October. And so most of our splits really had to occur during the stage 2, or the spring months. So somewhere between probably, I mean, spring is different here, obviously. And so our splits in the Midwest would typically occur probably, late April, early May, all the way up into to June. But here in Texas, you sort of have a longer window to do your splits. And so you can split somewhere between like late February all the way into August. And so some beekeepers even do some kind of late season overwintering splits or nooks. And so that's definitely an option. You could almost even make your splits and nooks in September. And I'm curious if anybody's ever done that before. What's the latest you guys have ever done your splits or your nooks? Because I think especially here in Texas and certain parts of Texas, there's a really heavy goldenrod flow in October that provides some nutrients to really build that nook and get them ready to go through the winter. So I'm not sure if there's any comments on the latest you guys have done splits. Yeah, so Dustin said July was the latest time he did splits. Yeah, so I've heard some people doing splits in September and they can overwinter really well. You have to make sure that the splits are really strongly made, so they're strong splits, but they're also you're going to be big enough and have enough resources to make it through the winter. Let me try to share this screen quick. But yeah, I'd probably typically recommend doing your splits or your Nook productions probably in the spring. That's probably the best time because, especially in certain parts of Texas, there's definitely a lot of resources available. So a lot of pollen and nectar, and you do have a lot more wiggle room and time to make your splits and get them ready and prepared for the winter. And so spring, to me is probably the best time to do the splits. But definitely summer splits there is a possibility, especially you have some resources, the late summer, early fall. But sometimes during the summertime, you have these pollinators, so there could be, less resources available for the splits, less time for them to grow and get ready. And so summer splits are definitely possible, but timing really matters. Yeah, James, you had a question?
Yeah, do you see a relationship between drone availability and splits? And the reason I'm asking this is that I've got a bunch of apiaries north of Canyon Lake, and the majority of them, I don't see any drone population yet.
Mhm.
And they are very healthy hives. I'm concerned they're going to swarm on me, but I never see any swarm cells. So I'm curious if there's a relationship between drone availability and splitting.
Yeah, for sure. And so I know right now we looked through our colonies and we popped a bunch of drones to see if they're mature or not. And the drones quite aren't quite mature yet. And I'm not sure where your location is and whether your colonies are producing drones yet. But I know for us, we probably have another couple of weeks before the drones are fully mature. But even then, we don't have a lot of drones available for mating. And so that could definitely impact you never still split, but could impact the number of drones that your queen's actually mating with. And so the really the best time is probably, mid-March to early April because there'd be a lot more drones available and more importantly, a lot more mature drones available. And so I know a lot of beekeepers try to do their splits like mid-February, late February, and the queen mating success is a lot lower because one, there's less drones, but the drones aren't quite mature yet. And so, yeah, it kind of depends on your area too, because if there's a lot of beekeepers around, they're obviously producing drones too. And so, even if your colonies are producing drones, there still could be drones out there.
Is it about 2 to 3 weeks before the drone becomes mature enough or fertile enough to mate?
I'd say at least 3 weeks. Yeah. So if you put drone comb in and once they emerge, I'd probably wait at least 3 weeks before those are actually sexually mature. I know our colonies started producing drones probably like late January, but they didn't produce many drones. And so now our colonies are really ramping up drone production with all the resources. And so we typically wait at least, 2 to 3 weeks. 3 weeks is probably the best. Okay, now we'll get into kind of the methods for splits and Nook production. So these are, I guess, really five different ways that I found to do splits. I've done, several of these. The one I haven't done is the Taranov split, and so I've had to talk about that. But overnight split is a really, easy method for splitting. It's something that a lot of beekeepers typically try, and so it's a really great way to make your splits and requires a lot less effort. Traditional splits can take a bit more time, but this is the method I typically use, and so I kind of gauge the colony when I get in and say, okay, this is how many nooks or splits I can make from this one colony, and so I typically rely on a traditional split. Um, I haven't talked to many beekeepers that have done vertical splits. I've done this before, um, but it's definitely less common than overnight and traditional splits. But vertical split is definitely one option, especially if you have the right equipment, like a double screen. But what's nice about traditional split is if your split doesn't raise a good queen or doesn't raise a queen at all, you can basically combine those colonies back into to one. And so vertical split can be a really great option for a smaller scale beekeeper. A swarm split is, I guess, it's basically the same as a traditional overnight split, but instead you're kind of waiting for those swarm cells to be produced. And once the swarm cells are produced, you basically make a split as sort of a swarm management technique. And so it's very similar to a traditional overnight split, but instead you're kind of waiting for those swarm cells to be produced. We have walkaway splits, so all these can be transitioned to a walkaway split. But basically, what that means is you're making your split or your nook and you're just walking away. And you're allowing those bees to naturally raise their own queens and those queens to naturally mate. And so a lot of beekeepers rely on walkaway splits because queen prices can be pretty expensive. And you may really like the genetics of one colony and you want them to raise queens from that one colony. So you can splits. One thing I always bring out is a queen cage, and so it really depends on when you make your split. Like, are you going to kill the queen and replace the queens from all the colonies, or are you going to keep that old queen? I typically try to requeen every single year because I always like a young, vigorous queen. But it really depends on your preferences. So if you really like that queen, you want to save that queen, you can definitely keep her. And so for a lot of these splits, it might be a good method to cage that queen temporarily. So if you want to put them into one certain colony or not. So this is a kind of a modified queen cage that I made. I really like it because it's smaller and it fits really well between two frames. And so I've made a modified version of this. I've also, kind of used a 3D printer to make my own version of this. Because kind of with these traditional queen cells, they're a little bit wide, and so it's harder to put them in between two frames. Whereas this one fits really well between two frames. This also works really well for our breeding program, and so it works really well to make our II queens and our crosses and introduce them to a colony. But there's definitely different ways to cage a queen. Um, I've never, well, I've used them before, but I'd rather just pick up the queen with my hand and put them into a queen cage versus using one of these queen catcher methods. But yeah, I mean, you don't necessarily have to catch a queen, but it's definitely an optional. If you do find a queen, you can cage her temporarily until after you make your split. One thing you'll need is probably Nook boxes if you decide to split into Nook boxes. And so there's different types. There's like wooden Nook boxes. This one is one where you actually need a bottom board with it, but some of these Nook boxes actually already come with a pre-attached bottom board and a cover and everything. And so if you buy these bottom wooden Nooks, there's a lot of different options that come with them. But one thing is I'll talk about there's sort of two different sizes of them. There's like ones that are five framers and four framers. Now the five framers, if you try to do overnight nooks on top of one colony, you only fit two four-frame wooden nooks on top of that, whereas the five framers are almost too big. So typically when you go to the store, you'll most likely find the five framers, but these four-frame wooden nooks can be really great for making overnight splits, especially if you want to make two nooks from one colony. You have these cardboard nook boxes, and so this is pretty common. The problem is, it can wear out really easily, and you probably don't want to store that outside for a longer period of time. But it's a really great option if you decide to make your own nooks and sell them to beekeepers, is to have these cardboard nook boxes because they are relatively cheap for beekeepers. And typically when you sell nooks to other beekeepers, they don't typically keep these boxes, and so you're not wasting the wood or the time or the money to invest into a better nook. We also have, Pro Nook boxes. So I've heard mixed reviews on them, but one thing I do like about them is they're plastic and pretty stable, and so they tend to last a lot longer than some of these cardboard Nook boxes. It can be a little funky to work with, but it does work pretty well. I typically prefer the wooden boxes, but the Pro Nooks are a really great option because they're cheap, they're reusable, especially compared to the wooden Nook boxes. And so if you decide to produce your own nooks, I'm sure there's other options out there, but these are probably the three most common. Other optional equipment you need, so this kind of depends on the type of split you're making. And so as we're talking about the vertical split, you'll need sort of a double screen board for that. And then for some of these other splits, you may need a queen excluder. So if you do like traditional or some overnight splits, you may need a queen excluder. So you make sure that the queen is isolated to one colony and unable to get to where your split is. And so depending on your type of method, you may need this type of equipment. But really a double screen board can be used for a lot of different reasons. And so I've seen this method used for, queen production or queen rearing. It can also be really effective for this type of split. So one thing you also have to consider is the queen introduction. So when you make a split, that new colony doesn't currently have a queen, and so you have to introduce a queen some way or form or fashion. So a lot of beekeepers really rely on the walkaway splits, and so that means you're putting really young brood, and this is really important. You want to make sure you have young brood. I mean, ideally you want eggs and maybe first instar larvae, so the larvae that just hatch, because the younger the brood, the higher quality your queen will be. So it's really important when you make your splits, especially if you do a walkaway split, to have that really young brood inside the colony. Really, the major benefit is there's no cost. You're allowing your own bees to raise their own queens. So you're not paying, $6 a queen cell or, $30 to $50 for these mated queens. And so there's no cost available for you. You're also using your own stock, and so maybe you like the genetics of a certain colony, maybe you like the demeanor of that colony, the honey production, or any type of trait. And so a situation you may want to keep the genetics of that colony, and so you can raise your own stock. And so as kind of James mentioned, it kind of depends on the drones, right? You could have the genetics of your colony really well with your queen, but the drones don't have the right genetics that could impact it. But at least you're still passing on at least 50% of the genetics to the future Nook or the future split. It does need time to mating, right? Because you're basically starting from that first instar, and so it takes 16 days for that queen to develop, and so you're basically waiting at least 2 weeks for those queens to emerge, and then you're waiting at least another week or 2 weeks for those queens to mate. And so you have sort of a longer timeline before those queens are really ready and actively laying. And so that could be another, 4 weeks before you actually have an active laying queen. So it does take a lot more time, but you do have the genetics in the colony and they could be more locally adapted to your area. The success rate can be lower. I wouldn't say it's always lower, but I would say it's a little bit lower than queen cells or mated queens because if a queen producer or maybe yourself are raising queens, you're controlling the graft, you're controlling the environment, and you're making sure you're raising the highest quality queens. Because if you ever raised queens before, sometimes if you're experienced, maybe you're grafting larvae that's too late or too old, and that impacts the queen quality. Or maybe sometimes it doesn't take at all. And so, I'd say a walkaway split can be a bit riskier, and I wouldn't say that they're always lower quality. I'm just saying there's more risk involved with that. And when I say lower risk, what I mean by that is if you have larvae that's too young in the colony and they're unable to raise a higher quality queen, that could definitely impact your success rate and maybe the queen longevity. Queen cells are a really great option. So, especially now, there's a lot of queen producers across Texas. So, whether you're doing it yourself or you know of a local queen producer, queen cells are a really great, cheap option. I know, we recently purchased queen cells from a local producer, and they were about $6 for a queen cell, and that's definitely a really great, cheap option. So, I mean, walkaway splits are probably the cheapest because there's no cost involved, obviously, but for queen cells, about $6 a queen cell. What another benefit is you have that local mating, and so maybe you're basically placing drone producing colonies in your area. You're trying to, push more drones in your DCAs, and so you can maybe have your more local mating. And so instead of buying queens that are open mated in Florida or California or another state, you know that your queens are locally mated here in Texas and your specific region. It does need a little bit of mating time, and so these queen cells, you typically buy them I'd say it's probably around 14 days. Kind of depends on, when you purchase them. Sometimes they're sold at 12 days, but just know that they need at least, a week, 2 weeks to emerge and then eventually, mate. So it's not as long as a walkaway split, but does need a bit more time. There is some risk for failure, and so if you put a queen cell into a colony, there's risk that the queen will be predated by birds. There's a risk that the weather's really poor, so she won't be able to fly maybe as many drones. There's also risk involved with the lack of drones or high quality drones available. And so, especially with the queen cell, there's definitely more risk involved. But I'd say this, it definitely is a really great option. And some beekeepers, they do put multiple queen cells in one colony. That's definitely one option. I typically put one queen in a cell colony because it's pretty easy for me to raise queens, but If you want to buy multiple queen cells and put them into the colony, but the only problem with that is they're going to be merged at the same time, and there could be some infighting between the queens. And so if two queens emerge at pretty much the same time and they kind of find each other, the queens will fight it out, and one queen will die, one queen will live. And that could lead to some damage for the queen. So sometimes if you add multiple queen cells, that can be really, really risky. Another option, especially a really common option, is buying a mated queen. So these are queens that have already been mated, and you basically purchase them because you put them in the colony and they begin, brooding up as soon as possible. So the major benefit is instant laying. They're pretty reliable for the most part. I know the introduction rate can be, I'd say I actually have a pretty good introduction rate. Maybe 95% or so. But depending on how you introduce them, you can have a little bit lower success, especially if you're paying for a lot more for these queens. So they also tend to be a bit more expensive. And so I know they're probably around 35 to $50 depending where you buy your queens. But the one problem is, oftentimes they're kind of open mated in California or Florida. Sometimes you might buy a queen from Texas, but a lot of times they're from other parts of the United States. And so you're not getting those known genetics that you know will perform really well here in Texas. And so there's a bit more risk involved. But there's also a bit more risk involved with failure. And so even though these are made already and we know that they're already active layings, that's why the beekeepers already sold the queens. There could be risk that she didn't mate with as many males or high quality males. Maybe the weather was really poor during this mating process, and oftentimes you don't know what that looked like because you're buying these mated queens. At least with queen cells, you really know what the weather looked like. You know, basically when your queens emerge, so you have a bit more information versus mated queens. It's kind of a black box. You have no idea what was happening when these queens are mated. So even though they can be reliable, there can be some risk involved with mated queens. Well, and also with mated queens, especially if you're buying them from different parts of the country, they're being shipped across the country. And so, they get stuck in FedEx or get stuck on a truck and they tend to overheat. That could directly impact the queen. So if the queen gets overheated or is stressed out during the shipping process, that could definitely impact the queen. So, I really love queen cells personally. I think queen cells is probably for me the best method. It's really reliable and you have to worry about the transportation stress and other stress involved. You also know that the queens are locally mating in your area. And so I typically prefer queen cells, but if you do buy mated queens, that's definitely one option, when you're doing your split or your nook. So the first method I'll talk about are overnight splits. So I think this is probably I'd say it's probably the second most common. I'd say probably traditional splits are the most common for beekeepers, especially here in Texas. What overnight split basically means is you're splitting a strong colony, dividing all the resources, but then you're allowing the workers to naturally migrate to that brood. And so instead of making sure you have enough bees and brood in your traditional split, you're allowing the bees to naturally migrate overnight into where the brood is. So it's actually a pretty quick process. So overnight, so what you can do is you can make your split, and then the next day, after those bees have migrated to where that brood is, you can divide that colony and move that colony to its new location. So it's actually a really quick process. I say it's probably one of the easiest process because you don't have to really find the queen at all. And so especially for a lot of new beekeepers that have difficulty finding the queen, I think the overnight split is a really quick process for them. The nurse bees stay with the brood, and so when you put in brood in that top box, those young nurse bees will naturally migrate there. Now, one issue with the traditional split, especially if you're not experienced, you may be shaking, older bees into that new split. And what's really important for making your split or your nook is to have really young nurse bees to take care of the bees, but also they haven't been through life yet, and so they're more willing to accept a new queen and accept the new nuke box. Though, I mean, I say it requires extra equipment, but really the only equipment you need is a queen excluder. And so that's a pretty cheap option. And most beekeepers already have a queen excluder, especially if you make sure your brood box are in one box or double deeps. And then you'll definitely need a new queen. So whether you're doing a walkaway split, buying a queen cell, or buying a mated queen, you'll need some kind of queen in the process to basically add a new queen to that recent split. So here's sort of the process. So, one, you want to choose a really strong colony. And so you don't want to choose a colony that only has four frames of bees. You want to have a sort of a large booming colony. Um, And so, because if you have a really small colony, you're taking resources away, that could directly impact not only the resources and the strength of that one colony you're splitting, but also impact your new split or your new nook. Next is to prepare your split. And so, it depends. Like if you're running double deep boxes, you want to split those double deeps into one. You already have the equipment available. But let's say you have a single or double deep, and you want to split that into a new box. You'll have to have the equipment ready and available. So you'll need the empty box available. You'll need maybe some empty frames available, preferably probably drawn out comb, maybe one or two frames of foundation, and have that all ready and available. You also need sort of a new bottom board and covers for your new split. So what I typically do is I divide the resources evenly between the established colony and the new nook, but you don't necessarily have to do that. You can make your split a little bit smaller with less resources, but I typically try to divide evenly just so the colonies are managed exactly the same, but it's really up to your preference. So I mean, let's say you have, 8 frames of brood in a colony. Maybe your new split can be, 2 or 3 frames. So it kind of depends on your preference and depends on the resource within the colony. Then after that, so once you move your resources, so you move your eggs, your brood, your cap brood, and maybe a frame of honey and pollen into that new box, you place a queen excluder right here. Well, basically you shake all the bees into this box, and so all those frames are empty from all the bees. It just has the frames of brood, eggs, and resources. You place that queen excluder, and then you put the frames on this top box. And then overnight, basically those nurse bees will migrate through the queen excluder into the brood frames. And so it's basically naturally populating that new split or that new nook with bees and young nurse bees, more importantly, because the young nurse bees are going to go up there to take care of the young brood and eggs and cat brood. And so you get a lot of those young bees. And so that's one good method about this is because you get those young bees into that new split. After 24 hours, so once those bees have fully migrated, you can remove that split and put into a new location. Now, I'd say a lot of beekeepers what they typically do is they try to replace these two. And so what they typically do is they put that new split at the current location and move the Savage colony to a new location. And the reason they do that is because all those foragers are coming back and they'll go back into that new split. So it really kind of boosts that one colony. But really with the overnight split, there should be enough bees migrating, so you don't necessarily have to do that. It's definitely a lot more work to kind of reverse these colonies. And so it kind of depends on your preference. But if you come back 24 hours later and there's not a lot of bees in that new split, so maybe you have maybe a few frames of bees, but not enough that you feel comfortable with, you can reverse those boxes to get some of those foragers and worker population coming back to that new split. And so it really depends on your preference, how many bees are migrating, and the type of resources you have during your split. So this is what the process typically looks like. So this is just kind of a quick outline. I have this all in the reading material, so I know this can look a little confusing. So hopefully this helps. But let's say we had a single, we were preparing this colony to split, and this is what the configuration looks like. So in this situation, we have a frame of honey on the left side, and then 2 frames of honey and pollen on the right side. This can also include a feeder. So sometimes people use frame feeders, and so these 2 frames would be replaced. But just in this situation, let's say we have 3 frames of honey and pollen. In the middle, we have these young eggs and young larvae. So we have frames that are pretty much full of eggs and really young larvae, so maybe first or 3-day-old larvae. We may have a few frames of older larvae that might be about capped, and then 2 frames of cap brood. So let's say we have this situation where obviously it's really booming. There's not a lot of open space for the queen to lay, and so this is a really great situation to split. So what I typically do is I'll split these resources up evenly. And so for this situation, I have 2 frames of honey and pollen at the bottom. I added 4 empty frames at the bottom, and I have 2 frames of older larvae, 1 frame of young eggs and larvae, and then cap brood. Because I want to add more of the eggs and young larvae into the new split. And what I do is I shake all the bees from the resources I put into this top box into this bottom box. So all the bees are still staying in this bottom box. Then I add a queen excluder and then add that box with all the other frames in the top box. And so in this situation, I pretty much made a 3 frame split where I had 3 frames of brood. So 1 frame of cap brood, 2 frames of young eggs and larvae, and then a frame of honey right in the middle. and then some empty frames. You can definitely move the honey frames out to the outside or add a frame feeder. Kind of depends on your preference. But this is how I would typically split the colony. But you can definitely do it different ways. Now, over 24 hours overnight, these bees will migrate from this bottom box all the way up to the young eggs and larvae. And so the next day, you'll have a lot of bees in this top box taking care of these young eggs and larvae. And that's one reason it's really important during your split to have these young eggs and larvae because, the nurse bees have to come up there and take care of the larvae. So it kind of pushes them to move to that new box and take care of the young eggs and larvae. And so it's really important to have more up in this top box versus the bottom box. But it's also important to have, cap brood because as you're raising a new queen, you want new young bees to take over that colony and emerge from that colony so they can take care of the new queen or potentially raise a new queen. Because once if you're really old bees right here, they're less willing to accept a mated queen. They're less willing to accept a queen cell. So it's really important to have not only young nurse bees moving up, but new bees emerging over the next, week or so. Then after 24 hours, you basically split this in half. So you take this top box and you move it to a new location. Like I said, you do have the option of reversing these. So you can put the queenless colony at the current location and with the queen right colony to a new location. So it's really up to your preference. But typically you have a lot more bees in this queen right colony. And so one reason a lot of beekeepers reverse these boxes is to make sure that more bees are coming back to this queenless colony. Because sometimes if you move this away, some of those bees could fly back to their original home, and that could make this new split or nerd nook a lot smaller. But yeah, like I said, once you have this queenless colony, you need this colony to either raise its own queen, so either doing a walkaway split, or you need to add a queen cell or a mated queen. So after this colony's been queenless for at least 24 hours, you can add in a queen cell. You can add in a mated queen, or you can, especially if you're young eggs and larvae, the colony will raise its own queen. I'd probably wait at least 24 hours before introducing any queens. 24 hours is kind of the earmark I use. You can definitely use less than that. I've added queens, after 12 hours, so there's definitely some leeway there. But typically I wait at least 24 hours if possible. Another process for overnight splits is make overnight nooks. And so this is a situation where instead of splitting a colony into two full colonies, you split one colony into two nook boxes. So basically exact same method, but instead of adding a deep box on top, you're adding two nook boxes on top and adding, resources between these two nook boxes. It's a really quick way to make two additional nooks. And so if you have a really large booming colony and you want to, split this into two multiple nooks, it's a really quick process of doing it. And it splits a large colony into two nooks. So you basically make one colony into three colonies. Now this does require some extra equipment, so you need a queen excluder and then two nook boxes. But just remember that you need the 4-frame nook boxes, and oftentimes at these bee supply stores, they only sell the 5-frame nook boxes. And if you add two 5-frame nook boxes on top of a large deep or 10-frame deep, then they won't fit on properly. So you need these 4-frame nooks. But I really like this method because it's really quick and it's a really easy way to make two nooks from one colony. So I really love this method. It just requires the nook boxes to actually do it properly. So basically the same situation, right? So let's say we have this one single deep, it's booming with bees, it has, all the resources, it has a young larva and eggs, it has an older brood, the cap brood, and some resources. So what I do is I basically shake all the bees to this bottom box and then basically add the brood and young brood into these two nuke boxes. So I'll add the queen excluder, add these two nuke boxes right on top of that queen excluder, and then I'll split the resource between these two nuke boxes. So depending on how big you want to make your nooks, it kind of depends on your preference. And so in this situation, I basically made 2-frame nooks. And what that means is I'm adding two frames of brood. You can make 3-frame nooks if you want. So you want kind of larger nooks, you can definitely do that. If you want to make 1-frame nooks, you can do that. Just know that the bigger the nook you make them, the faster they'll grow and the faster they'll get into the summer. So I typically prefer at least 2 frames, but you can definitely get by with 1 frame. You can even do 4 frames if you want. Just know that you'll have to kind of move those to a larger colony sooner rather than later. So in this situation, we had a queen excluder, two of these 4-frame nook boxes, and then we have 2 frames of brood for each one. I always leave at least one empty frame so the queen has a place to lay eggs. And this will be really important, especially.
You just muted, Garrett. You just went on mute.
Okay, did I miss anything? Did I or just happen?
It like just happened 30
Weird.
seconds ago.
That's weird. I didn't press anything, so I'm not sure what happened. Um, yeah. So when you
My
add these,
gosh.
when you add like a mated queen, for example, so let's say you're adding mated queens that you purchase into these.
Huh.
Okay, that happened again.
Yeah, I'm not pressing anything. I'm not sure. Maybe it's because I'm shaking my hands. I'm not sure. Okay, let's try this again and see what happens.
Okay.
But yeah, if you're buying a mated queen, it's really important to have an empty frame available because that queen's ready to start laying eggs and you need to have a space available. But if you're adding I'm not sure. This keeps muting on me. Okay. I'm trying not to touch anything. Yeah, so yeah, but if you add like a queen cell or you add a if you do like a walkway split, you do have some time. And so
Hey, I don't know if y'all have the mute all button, but if you do, don't press that.
yeah, it's happened like 3 or 4 times, and so I've
Yeah,
never heard this before.
okay.
Well, let's try it one more time, and if it happens again, maybe I can kind of shut out the
It happened again.
happen again. Maybe somebody's playing a joke on me.
Maybe.
Okay, Heather, maybe you can look that up and maybe kind of figure out what's happening, and then I'll just keep going and see if we can kind of push through this.
Okay.
Because I'm not sure why. Yeah, the overnight those bees will naturally migrate to those four frame nooks, and then after 24 hours, you can move those nooks and move them to a new location. So this is definitely a method I use quite often. So this is something that's pretty easy to make two nooks out of one large colony. So it's definitely an effective method. You just need sort of the four frame nooks available. But if you're only planning on doing a few, it's not that big of a cost. Or if you want to make your own boxes, you can definitely do that too. So probably the most common method are the traditional splits. This does require a bit more effort and more time versus an overnight split because you do have to find the queen and know which colony is queenless. That's not always the case, but it's preferable to know which colony is queenless and which ones are queen right. And so for traditional split, what you basically do is you're getting all your box available, your nuke box available. You're taking frames of brood and bees and then moving them to the new boxes or the new nuke boxes. And so you're typically evenly distributing the brood, honey, and pollen to these splits. For nooks, you can make smaller or larger nooks depending on your preference. So you make one frame nooks or four three frame nooks depending on your preference. One half, so typically one half of the split retains the original queen while the other one becomes queenless. And so the queenless one either has to one raise its own queen, or two, you're introducing either a queen cell or a mated queen. So this is a pretty common, straightforward method for colony expansion. I'd say the overnight split is probably the easiest and less work involved because you have to find the queen. But this is something that I guess I typically do because it allows me to kind of assess the resources and determine how many splits I want to make. So if you have a really large colony, you could potentially make, multiple splits in that one colony. But if it's small, you may be able to make one split from it. And so traditional split allows me to kind of gauge how much I want to move to different colonies. So here's a typical method. So similar to the previous one, you're choosing a really strong colony. So you don't want to choose a dink. You want to choose a colony that has a lot of not only brood, but a lot of bees and other resources. And so you want to make sure you have a strong colony making your split, especially if you try to really start trying to split these colonies multiple times. Next, for this, you want to prepare your splits. You want to have an empty box available. And so you want to have some empty frames available, an empty box, maybe a bottom board and a cover all available. Next, you want to, locate the queen. Now, this isn't always the case because you can always do check back, so come back later and see which one had the queen and which one didn't have the queen. But, if you can find the queen right away, you can definitely know which one's queen right and which one's queenless and which one you want to introduce a queen to. But if you have a tough time finding the queen during your split and you're doing a traditional split, you can always split the colonies, come back later and see which colony has eggs and young brood and which one colony doesn't, and that gives you some information on which one you want to add the queens to. Now for splits, I typically divide the resources evenly because I'm typically making basically two deeps into, or I guess one stack of deeps, so two double deeps into two separate deeps. And so I try to divide the resources evenly. But it's really up to your preference. So you can make smaller splits if you want to. You can add, 2 to 3 frames of brood into one split, or you can do larger splits. It kind of depends on how many resources in the colony and how heavily you want to split that colony. After you make your split, you just move the split to a to a new location. Now I've moved splits, pretty near the old colony, and sometimes if you do that, that old workforce will fly in, but I mean, really a lot of the bees will stay in that colony, and so if you're not moving too far away, obviously some bees will fly back to the original colony. So that's why I typically say that distance is not a concern. If you can move those colonies farther away, you know for sure that those workforce aren't going back to the original colony. But yeah, if you're only moving them 10 feet away, you can do that. Just know that some bees will fly back to the original colony. And that's something, one reason that some people kind of reverse the colonies. So when they make the split, they put the queenless colony on the original location and the queen red colony to a new location close by because they're trying to, add more bees to that new split with the queenless colony. So it's really up to your preference, but just know that some of these bees will fly back. And then at some point you want to introduce the queen and then do checkbacks probably 7 to 10 days later to see if the queen mated and began laying eggs. So this is a kind of method for traditional split. I mean, it's really the exact same thing as an overnight split, but instead of having a queen excluder and allowing the bees to migrate over 24 hours, you're basically adding bees and brood to that one box and then moving it to a new location. And so for this situation, I had this single box. Remember, it's a really strong colony. It had a lot of brood. So this has at least 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 frames of brood. And so I'm splitting those 7 frames evenly between the two boxes. But remember that you're not actually shaking the bees to the bottom box of the overnight split. So you need to move the brood and the bees to that new split. And so you want to make sure that there's enough bees that can take care of the brood, and you want to make sure that there's enough brood in that colony. So in some situations, especially if you don't have a lot of bees in some of these frames, you may want to shake a few bees into this new split to make sure there's enough worker population readily available during your splits. And so one thing with the overnight split is that the bees are naturally migrating, but for the traditional split, you may need to add not only the brood and honey, but also add some more bees if it is smaller. But typically, I don't have any issues. I mean, if you're moving the brood frames over, you're moving the young nurse bees over, and so it's never been an issue for me. But certain situations where maybe you're moving a brood frame over and there's not a lot of bees on it, you may want to shake more bees into this box, just so the bees are as evenly distributed between the two boxes as possible. So once you move the bees, the brood, and a few frames of honey into this new split or this new box, you can move that to a new location. Or you can potentially reverse these boxes and move the queen red colony to a new location and keep the queenless colony at the old location. Now, once the situation, it gets you a few different options for queen introduction. You can either transition this into a walkaway split, and so meaning that you're basically allowing the colony to raise its own queens. You can add a queen cell or add a mated queen to this colony. But yeah, especially with this, it's important. I mean, really for any type of splitting method to do some checkbacks. So that means checking the colony back later to make sure that they accepted the queen because you don't get a situation where introduce you did a walkway split, you introduced a queen cell or a mated queen, and then for some reason that queen didn't take. And so you have to come back and you want to make sure that colony doesn't become queenless or hopelessly queenless. But if it becomes hopelessly queenless, there's sort of a point of no return. It's really hard to introduce a queen at that point, especially if you have older workers and they've lived life, and so they're less willing to accept a new queen. And so you want to do checkbacks to see if you need to add a new queen, new frames of brood, and so on. So this example of some traditional nooks. So you have to do a traditional split, so meaning you're splitting a large colony into deeps. But in a situation, you may want to split that colony into, 4 to 5 frame nooks. And so, some colonies are large enough where you can, maybe take 2 to 3 nooks from a really large colony, especially into the spring. And so the example of one of our operations at Purdue, we made a bunch of 4 frame nooks from our bees, and these are really great colonies. So, I mean, the methods are exactly the same. Basically, you take your box with a bunch of brood, young larvae, and honey, and then take some of those resources and split them evenly between the 3 colonies. So, like I mentioned earlier, it kind of depends on how big you want to make your nooks. So, the more brood and bees, the larger the nooks are. But you can also make nooks that only have 1 frame of brood. You can do them with 2 frames of brood. You can do them with 4 frames of brood if you want to, if you want them larger. So, it kind of depends on one, how many resources you have in the colony, and two, how much you want to divide this larger colony. So, I typically make my splits somewhere between 2 to 3 frames of brood. And I always add, maybe 1 to 2 frames of empty frames and then 1 frame of honey. So for me, I always think like 2 frames is a really good number to use for your nooks, but you definitely use less or even more. Now it's really important to have these empty frames, especially if you're introducing a mated queen because she's ready to start laying eggs right away. And so, if you have those empty frames available, the queen's ready to start laying eggs and has space to lay eggs. But you also make sure you have young larvae in here, so and cap brood, so those young bees are emerging and going to eventually take over and really accept the new queen. Now, cat brood is gonna be really important to have in these colonies, especially when you're introducing a queen cell or having them raise their own queens, because as the queens get old, or as the workers get older, they're less likely to accept a new queen. So having those new workers, kind of fresh workers that have never been exposed to a queen before, they're gonna be more willing to accept the new queen that's introduced. Vertical split is another option. I'm not sure if many beekeepers here have done a vertical split. I've done it a few times, but I typically rely on an overnight split or just a traditional split. But a vertical split is definitely one option. But basically, it's actually very similar to. It's basically a mixture of an. Well, yeah, I guess it's more of an overnight split, but you're basically putting that overnight or that traditional split on top of the large colony. But instead of using a queen excluder, you're dividing with a double screen board. But the entrances are going to be facing different directions. So basically, you have 2 colonies on top of each other, divided by a double screen board, and the original colony, its entrance is maybe one way, and then the new colony top's facing the other way. And so basically the both colonies stay on the same hive setup, and that gives you some time where the warmth is being shared from the bottom colony to the new colony. You have this double screen board that separates them, and they have entrances multiple directions. And it's really useful for early season splits. It's also a really great method for queen rearing. So if you're making your split on top, you can transition that into a queen rearing colony. And so this is a pretty common method for queen rearing because you can basically combine those colonies again. So you can transition that into a queen rearing colony, and then once you're done raising queens, you can basically take that double screen bot out and then combine those colonies once again. So it's a really great way for queen rearing. It's because it's really easy to reunite the split if unsuccessful and the queen's not accepted. So this is what a double screen looks like. And so instead of I guess one screen as double screen, and what happens here is the workers are unable to move up and down from this colony. The queen's unable to move up and down from the colony, and so all the bees you put in that top box are going to stay in that top box. But what's useful about this double screen is they're sharing like scents and pheromones between the screens. They're sharing warmth between the screens, and so this makes this method really useful because it's really easy to combine those colonies once again. But because these are isolated between the two, you don't have the workers on the bottom that have a queen. They're not going to come up and kill your queen cells because they're really divided this way. And they're also, their entrances are faced in different directions. So the workers from the queen red colony are going to one entrance, whereas the workers from the queenless colony are going to a different entrance. So there's not as much interaction as you think there would be. So what we do is basically the same thing. You choose a really large colony. So similar to beforehand, where you want to have a large population and a lot of resources. Same with traditional split. You want to have all your empty boxes. You wouldn't need a cover or bottom board for this method, but you need empty boxes and some empty frames. You want to find the queen because for this method, it's really important to find the queen. And you want to make sure the queen is in the bottom of this box because if the queen's on the top, then you have a potential for interrupting your queen rearing and your queen production. And then you divide the resources evenly, and And when you divide resource similar to a traditional split, you want to divide not only the resources like the brood and the honey, but also the bees in that top box. And then you basically add this double screen board, put the top box in part, and make sure this entrance right here is open and facing the opposite direction. So the top box maybe the entrance is this way, but the bottom box of the queen right colony is facing this way. And then you set them on top, and then I guess you have different methods. You can either introduce a queen right away, so you can have them do a walkway split. You can add a queen cell or a mated queen, or you can turn this into a queen rearing colony. So let's say you want to raise some multiple queens. You can start raising queens, making those queen cells and populating them in your other nooks, and then eventually keeping one queen cell in the top box, have them raise a new queen, and then eventually splitting that. And so this can be useful, especially if you want to raise a few queens. So, I mean, the method is exactly the same as a traditional split. The only difference is you're adding this double screen board and stacking it on top. So this is the exact same colony that we talked about beforehand, 8 to 9 frames of brood, a lot of bees. And so what you do is you split the resources evenly between the original colony and the new colony. You add this double screen board, and then you stack this colony on top with not only the resources, not only the brood, but also the bees on top. And so important that this entrance is facing the opposite direction versus this one. And this double screen board has entrances multiple directions, and so you can kind of modify it based on where you want the entrance to be. And so it kind of depends on, I guess, what you're thinking about using this for. So if you're planning on raising queens using this is a really great method to consistently raise queens. The one thing I do recommend, especially you turn this to a queen raising colony and you plan on doing this for multiple weeks, you want to make sure that you add cap brood from the bottom up here so you have consistently more young bees introduced into this top box. And so, sometimes I use this for queen rearing. I might raise queens for 2 to 3 weeks up to a month. And so in that situation, I want to always add cap brood from the bottom onto this top box. But if you're just doing a split and you're planning on raising queens, you can basically introduce a queen into this colony. So either do a walkway split, or you can add a queen cell or mate a queen, and then you can make sure that the queen is introduced properly. Now, what's great about this, let's say something happens to the queen. So maybe the mated queen doesn't get introduced properly. Maybe the queen cell doesn't emerge or dies during mating flight, or maybe the walkaway split fails. You can basically easily combine these colonies back together by removing this double screen board and adding on top. And so this gives you some options in case something happens to the queen during introduction. Now, once your queen is started laying eggs, you have a queen in your colony, you can divide this colony and move it to a different location. So this vertical split, I don't use it very often unless I'm doing queen rearing, but it's definitely a method that a lot of beekeepers have started doing. A swarm split is sort of a proactive method where colonies split when the queen cells are spotted. And so let's say your colony begins raising queen cells like this. So you have a lot of bees in your colony. There's not enough resources or space for the queen to lay eggs. So the colony's pretty much deciding that they want to swarm off and find a new home. So in that situation, let's say you have queen cells that aren't capped or that are still capped, and the queen hasn't emerged yet. This is a good situation where you could split the colony. So so basically your colony is ready to split into another colony. And so it's already ready to form a new colony. And really the best case scenario is your bees aren't flying off to a tree branch. You have to try to recover that tree branch. And so this is a really great method to really target that impulse of the bees to swarm and still make multiple colonies from it that you know where they are and they're gonna be more likely to be accepted. So this situation where let's say you have a really strong colony and you see a bunch of swarm cells that are still capped, because if they're uncapped and the queen's already emerged, there's a good chance that that colony is about to swarm or has already swarmed already. Now, if these capped and you find the virgin queen in here and she has got a mating flight, you can still kill her and then make your split that way. But you want to try to do this right when you start seeing these swarm cells at the bottom. So similar to a traditional split, you divide the resources evenly. So you get your boxes, you locate the old queen, and then you add basically the frames of the swarm cells into that new box. So you want to make sure that there's no swarm cells in your current box with the queen red colony, because if there is, there's a potential that that colony could still swarm. And so if you're making your split and you're moving swarm cells to that colony that already has a queen, you may want to cut those swarm cells so those queens don't emerge, but make sure that you move the swarm cells and keep them intact when you move them to the new splits. I'm not sure why I said introduce a queen, but I guess when I say introduce a queen, you're basically introducing these swarm cells into that new colony. James, you had a question?
Yeah, can you stimulate a swarming behavior by adding additional nurse bees from another hive?
For sure, yeah. So one thing I do for queen rearing is I make an artificial swarm, and so I just get a bunch of bees in one box, and then they're really ramped up to raise a new queen, and they produce really great queens. That's one thing that I really love about swarm splits and making artificial swarms is they make in my personal opinion, I think they make the best queens and the highest quality queens, and so that's definitely one method. And once you get to the Terranode method, you basically make an artificial swarm, kind of like we were referring to. And Heather has a bit more experience with that, but I would say that these swarm cells make the best queens and the highest quality queens in my experience. Method, Heather can talk about that a bit more because you basically make an artificial swarm that way. So I mean, this method is pretty much exactly the same. I mean, all these splitting methods are very similar to each other, where you're taking a strong colony that has, it's not only queen right, but also has queen cells. You're splitting that colony in half, where you divide the resources evenly between the new split and the old colony. One colony will have the queen and the old queen, and the new colony will have the queen cells. But you want to make sure that none of the queen cells are inside the queen right colony. If there is, you may want to cut them and make sure those queens don't emerge. And so it's basically the exact same method. It's not too dissimilar. And like I mentioned beforehand, you can make these splits as big and as small as you want to. You can make one frame splits if you want, or you can make, 4 or 5 frame splits, depending on how many resources you have and how big you want to make that split. Walkway split. So all these different methods can be transitioned to a walkway split, but basically what that means is you're basically allowing the workers to naturally make their own queens. So like James mentioned, if you're trying to make your bees really swarmy to raise queens, that's a form of a walkway split. Or if you're allowed to raise your own queens from the brood in the colony, that's another form of walkway split. So if you're looking to do an overnight split, a traditional split, or the swarm split, you can do sort of a walkway split type method. Now, what's really important about this is you want to make sure you have young brood in this colony. So I typically add at least eggs and really young larvae that hatch within 12 hours because those raise the highest quality queens. Because if your larvae are too old, then the queens will be smaller and lower quality. And so that's why your success rate can be lower if you don't have higher quality queens inside your colony. What's great about this is it's a very flexible method and it can be adapted to any type of split method, whether it's a traditional overnight or vertical split. But you want to make sure that you have young larva present inside the queenless colony. It's cost effective, right? You have to buy a queen cell or a mated queen, so there's no cost available to you. You're also, basically, if you like the genetics of a colony, you're trying to maintain those genetics into the future colony. There can be some risks available, but there's risk with anything related to beekeeping. Now, one thing I'll say about all these different splitting methods that I don't think I really touched on is I'm kind of mentioning that you keep the queen in one colony, but there is an option where you can make both colonies queenless for all these different splitting methods. So you can, kill the queen and then add queens to both colonies, whether you're doing a walkaway split, whether you're adding queen cells or you're adding a mated queen. So, if you're making a split, you have the option of, replacing that old queen, especially if you start seeing signs that she's starting to fail and you might want to replace her. So for me, I always like to have a young, vigorous queen in my colony, especially since we see that queens start failing into that year two, and so it just kind of reduces your risk of that queen failing and having issues. So you have the option of keeping the old queen, or you can add a new queen. It kind of depends up to you. But if you really want to track your queen and see how well she performs, how long she lives, that's also a really viable option. So now I'm going to turn it over to Heather because I know she has more experience with a Terra now split. And maybe I'm saying the word wrong, but she can talk more about this.
Yeah, that's how I say it, Garrett. So, and I've got a, actually, do you mind if I share my screen?
Okay, you're good.
Okay. Let's see. Okay, well, that's what I'm looking for. Okay. So the concept with the tearing off split is if you have swarm cells in your hive and your hive's ready to swarm and you want to stop that, you basically create an artificial swarm. And so um, there's different ways to do it, and some people say there's a special distance. You do need to have um, basically the ramp that you create far enough away from where your original hive is so that only your foragers fly back to that hive, and then all of your young bees will go to the new hive, um, and they will go with your queen. So you're literally going to take your entire hive apart and shake it on this ramp that you create, and your queen is going to go walk up the ramp. And then I always put a box underneath here, and so I'm going to show you that picture. Can y'all see that picture?
Yes.
Okay, cool. So yeah, so this is kind of what it looks like. Is you create that ramp, they fly back, your queen walks up, and so she goes underneath here. All your young bees go underneath here because they can't fly back, and all your foragers go here. One thing that I will note, and Garrett, you can go ahead and go back to sharing your screen. It's fine. Um, one thing that I will note that I had an issue with one time that I did it was heat, and I didn't really think about the fact that, all those foragers that were going back to the original hive, that there's not going to be any young bees in that box. And we were doing it out in an apiary that was full sun. I have a lot of screen bottom boards, and this was a not screen bottom board. And so that hive where the foragers were going back to overheated. So, be aware of that. I think it's probably a good method to do in the spring when it's cool enough to do. Um, but yeah, so do you guys have any questions about that? And I'll send a link for a video that I watched before I actually did it myself. That's a really good one. It's fun to do. It's just you can see it's a lot of bees. And you have to shake every single frame. Oh, one other thing to mention is you don't want to shake your frames that have your queen cells on it. So to talk about that a little bit, your queen cells, of course, are going to go into this original box because your queen is going to be in a box that's right here. It is a little messy. Okay.
Yeah, I've never tried before, but I'm really curious. So yeah, maybe we can try it sometime
I
this
will say
this
it's
spring.
fun.
Yeah.
Like it's something fun, and I've done it a handful of times, but yeah.
Yeah, maybe we can make a video on it because I'm curious to see how well it works. I've never tried it before. I made swarm boxes for queen rearing, but I always just move those to a different split. So I've never tried this method before.
Mhm.
Is there any type of splits that I didn't cover? These are probably the main ones. I can't think of any other splits that I guess these are the ones I've done, and these ones I kind of looked up. I mean, there's another method I'm missing. But I mean, there's really not a wrong way of making your splits. There's a lot of different ways of doing it, and so it's one thing you can kind of play around with it, and it's. I mean, for a lot of new beekeepers, it can seem very intimidating, but it's really not that hard to make a split. There's not really a right or wrong way of doing it. There's a lot of different ways of doing it, right, with beekeeping. So these are just kind of general guidelines on how to make your splits. Okay, now we get into packages. And so any beekeepers here, make packages? Yeah, I miss like Demery split, do a little split. Yeah, these are different splitting methods. Yeah, that I didn't touch on. Yeah, so there's really less reason to, make packages, But I mean let's say you're a beekeeper and you want to start selling bees. I do recommend selling nooks because you have brood and established queen already. But there's some advantages, so it's very convenient. so easy transportable and ready available. So if you do decide to sell bees across state lines, you could produce nooks and sell them that way. It can be cheaper than, raising your own brood and be scalable to large scale operation, or if you want to sell bees across the country. Disadvantages, especially for a beekeeper, is the bees must build comb and brood from scratch. This was stressed, especially if you're shipping bees across different parts of Texas or into the United States. So there can be some handling stress related to bees, and there can be some mating risks. So there's probably less reason for a beekeeper to make a nook. I mean, maybe I guess if you have a top bar colony, for example, that situation you might want to make a package, but in that situation, you might want to just like shake bees really directly into the top bar colony. So on the commercial levels, when they're making these packages, this is what sort of the setup looks like. They have kind of this measuring cup that measures how many bees are putting into the colony. But basically, this is at the bottom of this. This is where you have this box that has this kind of top opening where you put the sugar feeder, but you open that and it fits right underneath this. And then you scoop the bees into this and you pour it here and it goes all the way into the package. And so this is what kind of looks like in the field where they're actually not measuring the bees, but they're kind of shaking these bees into this device and it's being shaken into the new package. And so if you ever want to get into packages, this is kind of a general method of doing it. You want to make sure you're finding the queen. You're not shaking the queen in there. You also want to make sure you have really young bees, and so you can add somewhere between 3 to 5 pounds of bees. That's probably a good number. But yeah, if you ever decide to make packages, it's a pretty simple and easy method. Okay, perfect. Well, we will take a 10-minute break, and we'll come back at 10:35. We'll talk about diagnosing queen issues and queen introduction.